Um, and I'd just like to take a minute to introduce Jonathan to people who don't know him. Many of us know Jonathan well, but I'm just really thrilled to introduce him and have him speaking to our group. He's our PhD alumni. He received his PhD from our program in 2009 and has gone on to a really influential and exemplary career. I'm so pleased that he's here to share that with us. He's currently professor at Loyola University, Chicago. He's an expert in suicide prevention, is the author, one of the authors of an important book in that area, which I put in the chat. And he served as the president of the American Association of Suicidality and was elected shortly before the pandemic. And he's known especially for his contributions to the use of technology in social work. And so one of the things that he had to do as president was immediately switch a large conference to remote. And so, that was among the challenges that he faced as the president of the largest membership organization of suicidology in 2019, 2020. I also wanted to particularly mention the Social Work podcast, which I hope many of you already know about and follow. But so he started the Social Work podcast in 2007 as a doctoral student here before podcasting was a thing. And it's like amazing to see now what a big thing podcasting is and how Jonathan was one of the first people to get there. So it has now posted 135 episodes, 40,000 monthly listeners, and it has more than 8 million downloads. I also put a reference to it in the chat. So just in case you're not already a follower, you can open that up. And in part because of this work, he was named a social work pioneer last year by the NASW. And I'm just, we're just so proud. Today he's going to be speaking about what does suicide prevention sound like, translating a federally funded study into an audio documentary. And I'm really just thrilled to hear his presentation. And Jonathan, I'm handing it over to you.
All right, that's fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Katie. Thank you for all the support that you've given me over the years. And it's so great to see so many folks here. From my past, it's lovely. It's a lovely homecoming. So thank you. So I'm going to talk through this project. And actually the name of this talk, what does school-based suicide prevention sound like? Turning a federally funded study into an audio documentary. I appreciated the opportunity to talk to you all because it helped me actually come up with that title. And I think that that's a really interesting way of kind of putting into words what I have been thinking about with this project. So there are these two problems worth solving, right? One of them is, why do kids feel like their lives aren't worth living? This is the suicide question. Oftentimes it's framed as, how can we keep kids from killing themselves, or how do we prevent suicide? But the bigger question is, why don't kids feel like their lives are worth living, and what is it that we can do to make sure this is a world worth living in? So that's one of the problems. And then the other one is, how do we disseminate rigorous scholarship beyond the academy? This is something that academics talk a lot about. For social work, it's a slightly different conversation than it is for anthropology or sociology or some of these more traditionally academic disciplines, because we as social workers, we are out there doing the work, right? And so we're a practice profession. We're always beyond the academy, but there are some amazing findings, right, that we spend years coming up with in social work research. And the question is, how do we get them to the people who need to have them? One of the ways that I sought to solve the problem was by starting the podcast. As Katie said, when I was a doctoral student at Pitt, I was teaching this practice theories class. I thought, wow, there's a lot of great information in this class that these students aren't going to remember or don't realize is particularly important because they're not out there practicing yet. And so how do we ensure that they're going to have access to that? And then the podcast was born. So that was one way. But doing podcast episodes is a little bit different than creating something that might go beyond the podcast as a product. And so I'll talk a little bit about that. But let me give a little bit of background to this idea of suicide prevention so that you have a little frame. And when we're talking about suicide prevention and we're talking about addressing suicide risk, particularly in youth, there's a lot of focus on how do you screen, how do you assess, what do the conversations look like, how do you ask questions that respectfully elicit information that's useful. And while that's great, one of the things that it does is it reinforces this idea that suicide is an individual problem. And one of the things that I always like to emphasize when I talk about suicide is that I see it as a social problem. I see it as a structural problem. And so if we want a world where people feel like their lives are worth living, we can't have societies that say that some lives are worth more than others. That's anathema to our goal of building a world worth living in. Now, when we think about youth suicide, of course, any one suicide death creates ripple effects throughout a community. And it's one death too many. But Jerry Reed, who's a social worker and also a big name in suicide prevention, has said behind every statistic is a tear. And so the stats that I give, these represent actual lives, hundreds of people per life whose sort of worlds were upended by these deaths. And when we think about suicide deaths over time for youth, and these are youth ages 10 to 24, what we can see is that in the 2000s, the rates went up, they went down. 2004 is when I started the doctoral program at Pitt. It sort of pretty much went down the whole time I was in my program. And I actually remember somebody saying, well, you're focusing on youth suicide. It looks like the rates are going down. How's that going to affect your career? Which again is kind of an interesting frame of mind to be in the academy. I think my response was something like, well, it would be great to not have a job, right? if that's why I'm out of a job, like that would be great. But what we can see is that starting in 2007, there's a pretty steady increase in youth suicide rates. Until we got to about 2017, 2018, 2019, it plateaued. And then 2020 and 2021, we had, again, a pretty steep rise. Now, these are rates of suicide. There's been a lot of speculation as to why. Some people have pointed to the introduction of the iPhone in 2007, Facebook going public around the same time, right? Sort of the launch of the social media. I think that's challenging because we've seen a steady increase in the use of social media and screen time for kids, and it hasn't correlated perfectly with increase in suicide rates. And in fact, if you look at 2022, the suicide rates went down pretty markedly, which does not, again, align with screen use or social media use for kids. But that's not the only way we can think about youth suicide. Another way to think about it is how many kids are dying in a given month, right? So if we think about over a given year, what does youth suicide look like? And these are data from 1999 to 2019, youth ages 10 to 19. So not 10 to 24, but 10 to 19. And I did it that way because 10 to 19 is solidly within primary, secondary education, right? You're not looking at college students. You're not looking at kids who are out of high school. And what you can see here is a pretty clear relationship between the academic school year. So the fewest number of suicide deaths happen in the vacation months, June, July, and December. The most number of suicide deaths happen in January, right after the fewest number, and then kind of midterms, April and October. Now, you'll notice this is through 2019, and I wanted to emphasize spring, the dotted black lines there. What you can see is that rates start high in January, they dip in February, and then they go up, peak in April, and then they go back down. Well, in 2020, we had this unprecedented natural experiment where you had suicide rates for youth drop for the first time since they've been collecting these data. Starts out the same, January's high, decreases in February, but instead of rising in March and April, they decrease. And May is actually, April and May, there are fewer suicide deaths than in the summer months. Now, obviously, what happened was the pandemic, right? Everybody went fully remote for a few months. Teenagers on average got about 45 minutes more sleep per night. There wasn't FOMO, fear of missing out, right? You weren't worried what Katie was doing on the weekend because she was stuck at home with her parents, just like I was. There was more informal time to connect with parents about things, right? We know with adolescents, they want to talk to parents, but they want to talk to parents when they want to talk to parents, not when the parents want to talk to them. And you know, there was an opportunity for oversight. Now, I'm not saying this was great. Obviously, you had kids that were misgendered, dead named, being abused, neglected, access to firearms, substance use. So, not saying that the sort of shelter in place was a great time for kids, but it did correlate with the decrease in suicide deaths. And perhaps most importantly, you know, we can point to the fact that everybody was kind of fighting the same invisible enemy. We didn't really know what was going on. We just knew people were dying. And then when kids went back to school, either hybrid, some folks went back fully in person, we saw the suicide deaths go up. And then if you look at 2021, the monthly data, we don't have it for 2022 yet, but I suspect the pattern will be the same. The green line is 2020, and then the black line is 2021. You can see that the pattern returned, right, when kids were back in school. So starts high in January, decreases in February, goes up, and then goes back down, goes up again, then goes back down. So what we can see is there is a pattern here, a relationship between school and suicide death. Now, as Katie mentioned, I mean, I've written a whole book about suicide in schools. I really believe in the importance of school-based suicide prevention. I think that it's a place where amazing work can happen. And then there's the question of like, what is going on in schools so that there is a correlation, not just between kids having thoughts of suicide, right, which you might attribute to sort of the increased stress of testing or the bullying or sort of the anxiety of being surrounded by thousands of kids you don't necessarily want to be around, or suicide attempts, but actual death, which for youth is an incredibly rare behavior. And so I, for many years now, I have followed the work of Anna Mueller and Seth Bruton, who are sociologists, and we've talked about their work looking at sort of the social roots of youth suicide, and particularly around schools. And so I guess about 4 years ago at this point, Anna and I were talking, maybe 5 years ago, actually. Yeah, we were talking about this project that she wanted to do. And this is the name in NIH Reporter. So I'm giving this name right here in case you want to look it up, and that's the number. This is the name of a study that really looks at how do schools prepare for and then respond to youth suicide death. And it's a 3-year NIMH-funded study. We're finishing up data. The grant ends, this summer, and one of the things that we were able to do was to have a mixed method, embedded ethnography study looking at 2 Colorado public school districts and 10 heterogeneous high schools. So 3 of which have serious and enduring youth suicide and suicide cluster problems. Now, it's Colorado in part because Anna had an existing relationship with Colorado. Her previous work, which she published in the book, The Social Roots of Youth Suicide, and also just fun fact, the book launch for her book is being hosted at the 92nd Street Y, and it's a moderated conversation with Malcolm Gladwell. So, which is kind of amazing to have an academic book get that kind of publicity. That's going to be in May, so check it out. It should be amazing. But the study had ethnographic observations. So in the first couple of years, nearly 700 observations, 140 interviews with staff, families, youth, and adults about youth suicide prevention, about postvention, which is how you respond after a student death. We surveyed school staff, custodial staff, teachers, administrators, and we got 568 responses to this survey, which we were really excited about. It was a great response rate. And then we surveyed parents and guardians in these schools, and we got 701 responses. And there were, and what I'll say is that because the findings are not out yet, I'm just going to sort of talk through them as opposed to like putting in a bunch of details without it necessarily being double checked or peer reviewed. But some of the things that we found were that the parents and the staff overwhelmingly agreed that suicide prevention should be something that happens in schools. This is actually a really important finding because there has not yet been research that has looked in the same school districts, that has had a large survey with a bunch of different folks representing those two groups, staff and parents, that have said, yes, this is something that we agree with. And when we broke it down by political affiliation, race and ethnicity, language, the surveys were done in Spanish and English, the majority of the respondents, regardless of all of those things, believe that suicide prevention should happen in schools. So this right here is a really important preliminary finding. Some of the other findings were that there was confusion, even though people believed that suicide prevention is something that should happen in school, there was, I wouldn't say confusion, there was ambiguity about who was responsible for what. And that in the schools where there was more ambiguity, that correlated with some of the other findings, some of the interviews where people were saying, yes, this is important, but I don't know how effective it's going to be, right? Some of the survey responses supported that idea. This speaks to a social aspect of school-based suicide prevention that has not been addressed very well in the literature, which really speaks to this idea of school climate. Who is responsible? What does that responsibility look like? What are they doing? How are they coordinating with community members? What do parents do? What do staff do? And these ideas, we have rich data, right? We have the interviews, we have the surveys, and so part of what I am interested in doing with these findings, and when the study's done, I actually have my very first research leave coming up in the fall. I'm very excited about it, so that I can dive into the data with Anna, drive down to Bloomington and hang out for a little while, and do some data analysis, do some writing. And then, in addition to writing like a main findings paper and all that good stuff, to take these findings and then turn them into an audio documentary. So let me talk a little bit about that. So as Katie mentioned, right, I have this podcast, but I've actually been involved in audio production since the early 90s. I'm a drummer. After college, I had the opportunity to go to Atlanta and do some studio sessions. I went to France and I studied jazz drumming for a year. When I lived in Austin, Texas, I did studio work. So I've had the experience of doing studio recording as a drummer. And then there was the podcast. When I was at Temple University, I was part of a year-long project for professors on producing audio content. Now, these weren't audio documentaries. These were sort of short snippets, sort of digital stories. I've coordinated with folks on different NPR programs like WHYY in Philadelphia's The Pulse, creating hour-long programs. So this is something that I have been really interested in. And I thought, well, we have some pretty interesting novel findings that shift the way that we think about school-based suicide prevention. In addition to these papers, let's create an audio documentary. Let's create something that can walk folks through what we've learned in a way that'll reach a broader audience. Now, there are many aspects to creating an audio documentary. Some of them are very much within the wheelhouse of social work, right? So a good audio documentary requires research, right? You need to make sure that the information that you're sharing is accurate, that you can provide some depth to the story. This, by the way, is one of the reasons why podcast series that are a couple of people talking to each other, like, drive me crazy for the most part, because it's a lot of chit chat and there's not a lot of depth. Every once in a while, somebody will drop, like a lot of insight, but it doesn't have what I'm looking for in terms of like depth. And it's one of the reasons why I love Radiolab, where I love This American Life, some of these other podcasts or radio shows where they actually really dive in and they make sure that everything that's being shared is spot on. You need to be able to do interviews. Well, the research has already conducted interviews, and you need to know how to create a narrative structure, right? A beginning, middle, and end. And even though this isn't something that we spend a lot of time on in terms of our classwork or our training, it is something that I have learned to think through as a professor when I'm creating a lecture, when I'm doing a slideshow, when I'm writing an article, like what's the beginning, what's the middle, what's the end. Now, there are a lot of things that are not social work that I have to consider when I'm doing an audio documentary. Part of it is script writing, right? You have to write a script for an audio documentary, right? You have to make sure that this narrative flows, right? That all the different elements like narration, clips from interviews, other pieces are put into this documentary in a way that is compelling and makes sense. Then there's the audio production side of it, quality sound recording. One of the things that I'm so grateful for about the University of Pittsburgh is that there was this media lab that I was able to use to start the podcast. And so what that meant was that from the very first episode, the podcast sounded good. And what I have learned is that as humans, we're very forgiving of crappy video, but we're not forgiving of crappy audio. So you can see something on YouTube that's like super low resolution and it has like 100 million views. But if you have a podcast series, and there's several of them that I will not mention because I'm not here to disparage anybody, but that have really bad audio, even if the guests are excellent, even if the content's great, nobody's listening to it. So I was really grateful for Pitt for having this media lab where I could start to record the podcast with high quality audio. And then I continued, and actually what I use is this. It's my Zoom H2 recorder that I've had for 13 years. And it records great audio. And so having quality sound recordings is really important. Figuring out what the voiceover and the narration is going to sound like when you have this script, right? Thinking about ambient sounds and soundscapes. All those wonderful clips that you hear on NPR where they're interviewing somebody, like let's say they're interviewing a football coach, right? And in the background, you can hear, the kids playing football. They don't record the coach and the kids at the same time. They record the coach in a quiet space, and then they record the kids separately, and then they merge the two layers of audio, right? So that they can have some control over how loud it is, what's going on. They need to make sure that there's not something that happens that interferes with the interview, right? So thinking about ambient sounds, soundscapes, sound effects, like do I want to use music? Sometimes having music can be great. It can also be problematic. I don't know about you all, but when I listen to podcasts, I like to listen to them at 1.2 or 1.25 speed. Sometimes I'll listen to them at 1.5 if I'm running behind. But if there's music in the background of those podcasts, 1.25 sounds terrible because the music gets glitchy. It gets compressed in a way that just spoken word doesn't. So you have to think about that. And then there's the ideas about like audio editing. How are you clipping things together? Where are you cutting somebody's comment off? Part of this has to do with ethics, right? Am I going to change the meaning of what somebody is saying by the edits that I make? And I actually looked at the Social Work Code of Ethics for this. I think about research ethics as part of this, because I do edit for the Social Work Podcast, mostly for clarity. And because when I'm talking, as you can hear, I use a lot of ahs and ums. I'll repeat words as I'm thinking through things. And I like to clean that up because my audience doesn't need to listen to that. They don't need to listen to my thought process. But when I'm interviewing somebody, the question is, does the space between the words, do their ahs and ums actually mean something important for what they're saying, because it reflects maybe a thought process or maybe something that they're hesitant about? So thinking about how you're editing the interviews, the audio, really important. Then there's post-production. And again, this is not social work, right? How do you take it? How do you make sure that it's sounding as good as possible? And then distribution and marketing, including social media. Now, what I will say is that none of the folks who were interviewed for this research project have consented to have their recorded interviews be part of a public documentary. So I have to think about, how do I get around that? And one of the ways that I've thought about it is instead of going to the source, right? Say we've interviewed a teacher, we've interviewed a student. Instead of trying to recreate that interview, even if they had great things to say, I can interview some of the researchers, right? And we could have a conversation where they could share that information in a way that wouldn't disclose that person's identity. It wouldn't sort of violate IRB, but it would get the point across. And so the audio or the interviews that I would have for this audio documentary would actually be the researchers. Now, it would be great to have some of the teachers and some of the students, but that is a bigger project, and I'm not funded for that. And so these are some of the ways that I've started to think about, how am I going to get around some of the practical issues of having some phenomenal data, but not having permission to use those in an audio documentary. And then in terms of distribution marketing, the good news is that the Social Work Podcast does have a large listener base. But I've also thought about, maybe I can do a 3-part. Oh, and I forgot to mention this. So the audio documentary, the narrative arc would be 3 parts. The first part would be a essentially, part one would be, what have we been doing in school-based suicide prevention? Part two would be, what did we find in the study? And part three would be, and so what does that now mean for the future of school-based suicide prevention? It would have been helpful if I had said that up front. So that's the three parts of the audio documentary. That's the narrative arc there. But I was thinking that there might be a way of having the social work podcast be a place where I can start to push it out while I'm still in conversation with folks about having it get even wider distribution, so that it is something that maybe goes out through school-based channels or is accessible to school boards or even legislators, right? Something like, how would this happen? I don't know how that would happen. It's part of my process for thinking through. That's why this is a work in progress. So anyway, so that's the idea behind turning this federally funded research study on schools and suicide prevention into an audio documentary. And I would love to hear your thoughts, would love to have a conversation about this. And so thanks for your attention. Hey, Sean.
Hey. How you doing, Jonathan?
Good. How you doing?
Great. I'm sorry I was late to your talk, but I caught the end of it and it's a great talk. I was thinking about implications for implementation research and dissemination. Nobody reads our journal articles, and they only slightly read our books more. I think if anybody knows anything about the work I do, it's because they went to the social work podcast. How can we use these tools for dissemination and implementation? It's been interesting to hear about this, thinking about this from the school systems, and you may be most prepared to speak in that regard, which would be great to hear. But I just love to hear research is no good if people don't use it.
Mm-hmm.
And this is an important implementation channel, I always thought. And so I just wondering, like how are you pushing this forward with the suicide work? And do you see any other avenues, that could be useful for broader beyond the school system?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that there's so one of the benefits of the audio documentary is that just like with the podcast, people can learn on the go. It can be incorporated into things. People can take segments and, if they're doing presentations, they're like, this is why we need to be making this change. Here's a little segment of audio. Folks in schools have to do professional development. And so one of the sort of questions or ways to think about this is, so if I'm going to be doing these, let's say that, I want to think about how long each part is. Listening to an hour of audio sounds like a lot. Like, I think all of us at this point are like, oh my God, really? I have to listen to an hour? So maybe if part one is actually an hour, maybe I structure it so that they're more like 20-minute segments, right? And that I can think about how would these then be part of professional development that schools can offer, right? So that it's already structured like that. There's also the question about what would it mean if you had an audio documentary and that the only visual component really is the transcript, right? For folks that are deaf or hard of hearing, like how would we meet those needs? And are there alternatives, right, that we could think about in terms of dissemination, distribution?
Do you ever think, this kind of medium could be used to help train people in evidence-based practices, in like serious, I know like for CET, for example, we've given overviews and that sort of thing, and it's been great. It's been great for that. But I just wondering, like, busy case managers, busy mental health clinicians, like, I don't know, could you bone up on your knowledge of evidence-based practice on the drive home? Or
Yeah.
something?
Well, I mean, I think that this is beyond the audio documentary, but like one of the things that I thought about while I was in the doctoral program was how could podcasts, right, or how could these audio segments that are pushed to people's phones or whatever they are be used as booster sessions. So let's say they go get trained in CET And what is it? It's like 450 sessions or something like that. It's like,
Yeah,
yeah,
about right. Yeah, no,
yeah,
just
this
like
this is a lot of stuff, right? So like you're about to go into, week 14, and you can skim it, but what if you had a 2 or 3 minute audio, right, booster to say, this is the point of today, and by the end of this group, if people are able to do this, then you've reached your goal. Like that could be really nice. It could improve adherence and fidelity. It could improve confidence. And especially if they're hearing your voice, for example, right? They're like, oh yeah, Sean's the one that trained me. I'm now listening to his voice. It could be a way to anchor it in the training. So I think all that's great. And anybody that has the time or energy, I always thought that I would. I haven't. I might. I don't know if I will. Who wanted to partner with somebody who's doing a clinical trial, who's doing one of these programs to create this, right? Then you could look and see, how is this group actually adhering better to the manual than this other group because they have these 2 to 3 minute boosters, right? So I think that actually there's a lot of possibility with that.
I also wonder, first I'd like to invite anybody, you feel free to raise your hand and I'm happy to acknowledge you, or I hope people feel comfortable just jumping in with observations and questions, just joining in the conversation as well. But I think even just from my own classroom teaching, people really don't read the way that they did when I was being educated. They just don't. Like paper and like reading on the screen is really different. And I take in a lot of information, but it's more surface, way more kind of like I scan it for the bullets if it's not already a bulleted piece, in a way that I didn't interact with text when text was, when education was almost 100% pieces of paper.
Yeah.
And so I think that, I almost wonder if this is going to be one of these innovations that like just jumps over the need to document it. Like, like Africa never really got phone system and then they just were able to go right to cellular, right? Like they never went through the intermediate period. Like, like it's just going to be necessary if you want to reach an audience that you're going to be able to use tools like these, and you're going to have a way to reach an audience with tools like these.
Yeah.
Do people have thoughts and questions about it?
Yeah, I had a question. I was thinking about, I can see how there's so many applications for disseminating information directly to school staff and faculty. I was wondering about to students and families as well, something targeted. And I was thinking particularly, so I have a colleague who's doing some postvention work in schools, and there's a lot of different barriers to that. And there was one that there was suicide cluster in which people were really excited and got positive feedback about the programming that happened. And then very quickly after that, there were complaints from parents about it taking away from academic time and that kind of thing. That finding about suicide prevention belongs in schools seemed really powerful to me. And, little snippets like that, maybe even leading up to postvention that kind of put families in the mindset could be really powerful. So I was just curious about those kind of applications.
No, and I think that your question about audience is really important. And what is it that parents either are ambivalent about, or where there's points of disagreement? I didn't go into all the details about like where the professionals and the parents disagreed, and there were some, right? And so that would be an important thing to highlight. That could be an important thing to highlight in the documentary, right? Because I mean, my daughter's 16. She's a sophomore in high school. She's driving, right? She's got her friend group. I share this in part for the folks that have known me for a long time who are like, oh my God, I can't believe that Emerson is 16. That's so weird. But the experience of parents is that we, especially with social media, right, we might get really upset about something that we see happening in schools, even more upset than our kids are getting. And it seems like the school's not responsive. And that dynamic, especially in today's climate, where people are really quick to not look for common ground, not look for ways forward, but instead to be like, well, I'm going to call the press. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that, right? It's sort of like, I'm going to make it contentious. I think that there could actually be a lot of benefit to what you're talking about in terms of helping people see perspectives, right? How is it that schools are thinking about this in a way that finds the nobility in their actions, right? To borrow a phrase from functional family therapy, right? This idea that if schools are doing this, or on the other side, that the schools are thinking, well, why would parents not be supportive of this? Oh, it's because in general, parents are thinking this. Well, so I think that kind of information could be really useful to have out there to build bridges and expand perspectives. So I think that's a great point. Thank you.
I was also curious about the permission part of it with the interviews. And I think that that also speaks to those of us with projects in the field, future projects, of how to write a consent form so that there would be ways that you could say that your words might be used. Because like one thing that occurred to me, and you've thought about this a lot, and I just have heard about it today. But like, could an actor read from the transcript, or is that still using somebody, you don't have permission to use their exact words, and so that would be going beyond?
Yeah, so my understanding is that you couldn't have somebody read somebody's direct words, even if it's not the person, because they didn't give consent for that content to be shared publicly. I do know that, and anybody that's done, kind of a clinical intervention trial where they've had to record sessions, and they, these sessions might be used for training purposes, right? There's already language built into those IRBs, and I think the next step would be to have something. And I haven't done this, so if somebody has, please jump in. But I think it would, for genuine informed consent, have to be a separate sheet of paper saying that this information might be used in a public documentary or some sort of public facing thing, not for professional development, but blah 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 blah. And do you agree to that? And it could be that you could decide later on, well, we didn't get agreement from everybody, so we're not going to use this. Or we could say, well, we got agreement from these two people, so we can use those and we'll move ahead. I don't know how you would do that, but I think that would have to be something that you would need. And I think it's a good idea, right, to have those so that you have the option. I mean, if it's something that you might do. If you're not going to do it, then it's just extra paperwork and forget about it, and don't waste anybody's time. But I think it's a great idea. And I have to say, I mean, so Katie, so for the the dissertation that I did on the the moms bringing their kids in for services, I mean, there were so many amazing quotes that over the years I've wanted to be able to turn that into something. Right, something public, because some of the ways that they framed things or shared things or put them into words was just perfect. Mm-hmm. But there was no permission for that, and so it just sort of sits, which is part of the issue. It just kind of sits, or eventually it gets destroyed. But so having it get out there, I think, is important to get permission.
And I think that's also part of the change in how we receive information and interact with media, because when we have permission to use exact quotes, but when we conducted that study, there wasn't an expectation that it would appear anywhere besides an academic journal.
That's
and
right.
Maybe a book. If
Mm-hmm.
somebody, you didn't have to ask for special permission if you wanted to then use one of those formats. But now there's so much content that a lot of it is not picked up, but now that content can be picked up expectedly or unexpectedly by millions of people, it's just, there's a different burden But I think that being mindful of, like, if you're doing something practice relevant and you want to be able to get it out there, to be mindful that like a separate consent, like you could consent to share your thoughts, and then you could consent to having the thoughts you shared themselves shared in some way that could be more public facing.
Yeah.
We're coming up on time. I've been trying to get in the habit of like giving people back another 5 minutes or so in case they need to prepare to get to another meeting or get somewhere. But do we have other questions or thoughts for Jonathan?
Not seeing any hands raised, Katie.
I'm really interested in your implementation idea, Jonathan, and I've got a grant going back in June. Can we talk about it?
Yeah, of
Like,
course.
like one of the big problems we have is people don't want to read. I've got a 450-page manual that nobody wants to use for anything but a doorstop. And so like how to get around that, because like that's how we deliver the information. Obviously, we need a new channel.
Yeah, let's talk, man.
This
Absolutely.
is like a great idea. Thanks so much.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate everybody showing up. It's